IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Aarushi Kataria. I'm a junior research scholar at the Takshashila Institution, and today with me I have Swarnashree, a student of philosophy at the Delhi University. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Today we'll be talking about something very close to my heart, which is discussing the role of political commitment and questions of ethics when it comes to public policy implementation in India. Specifically, we look at a case study of the public distribution system, which is one of the oldest policies that has existed in India. Now, we are going to reverse the script a little bit, where I won't be the one asking the questions. I have Swarnashree, who's had these conversations with me multiple times regarding the PDS implementation of policies, and she has the questions ready for me. So, Swarnashree, do you want to start?
Right. But before I move on to my questions, I think for the benefit of all the listeners here, would you want to talk more about what is PDS and explain something about it?
Right. So the PDS is nothing but the public distribution system. It originally began in some form even before India was an independent country as a part of the World War II efforts of the British to secure cheap food supplies for the army camp areas. That means it's been present for over 70 years in India. But today, in the modern era, when we think about the public distribution system, the first thing that comes to mind is often ration shops. The ration shop or fair price shops are nothing but a network of markets that are parallel to the general market that we see, which is controlled by the government, because these shops only sell the goods that the government is supplying at the prices determined by the government. Who is the PDS for? Largely, the PDS is aimed for the poor people, which aims to supply them with subsidized food grains in the form of mostly rice, wheat, and millets. But what has been the trajectory of the PDS itself? The PDS began originally after independence as something that was to supply food grains at subsidized rates to consumers. In 1997, it was revised into the targeted PDS system, which meant that the only beneficiaries were going to be those below the poverty line. And more recently, in 2012, it was transformed again under the National Food Security Act, or NFSA as we know it, which implicitly has made the PDS into a quasi-universal system, because the NFSA specifies that each state must cover over 75% of its rural population and 50% of its urban population. And overall, this comes out to be about 66% of India's population, which is to say 2/3 of our population are now covered by the Food Security Act. And I think that's very important when we think about the aim of the PDS itself. The PDS aims to be a guarantee for food security for poor families when they don't have the means to buy from the open market because of limited incomes and high prices. And the PDS is now going to be able to serve a lot more people under the NFSA. And we have seen that post 2011-12, the implementation for NFSA has become much better.
Right. How successful do you think PDS has been till now?
I don't think there's any straight answer to that question, really, because if you were to look at states like Chhattisgarh, they have achieved remarkable success when it comes to their PDS, with leakages being probably as low as 10 to 12%. States like Tamil Nadu have had single digit leakages, but you also have states like Bihar that have almost 90% leakage at some point in time. And I think that's where the question comes in about center state allocation under the PDS. So while the center is responsible for procuring food grains at a national level, allocating the food grains to each and every state, it's a responsibility of the state governments themselves to transport this grain, distribute it among the different dealerships, identify the beneficiaries in each state, pay commissions to the dealerships, etc. But apart from that, more recently, if we were to think about COVID-19 and what role has the PDS played, there was recently a paper by Bhalla and Veermani as a part of the IMF working paper series, and they've said that India didn't see a drastic fall in its proportion of people who are poor. And they attributed this to the success of the PDS system, which was able to implicitly act as an income transfer to the people. It was able to ensure food security by providing them with the necessary grains. This was also sort of compounded by the fact that India had an additional, 5 kg policy where it attributed grains to every single household. And this ensured that people were able to get food that they required at subsidized prices, and they were able to tide over the bad times. So I think that's the most important role of the PDS. And we've seen that at least during the pandemic, in a time of crisis, it's been able to succeed. However, I must say this with a word of caution, because after the implementation of the NFSA, there have been no large scale studies that have come out about, how successful has the NFSA been after its change from the TPDS that was introduced in 1997.
That makes sense. You mentioned about how the state takes up the leadership to ensure that there is a distribution that happens among the people properly. However, we note a very clear, stark difference that happens between the ration that is prescribed by the Department of Food and Public Distribution, the ration that is reported by the fair price shops, and the ration that is actually received by the people on ground, by the customers. How do you reconcile these differences that exist?
So I think this sort of brings me to the point of bureaucratic mobilization. So one thing to understand is that these dealerships are only allowed to sell what has been prescribed under the Act or under the targeted PDS system, which was generally rice, wheat, millet, or any sugar, salt, kerosene, something like that, which means that their volumes are very, very limited. People are only going to come in to buy what you are selling, and you are selling a very small variety of goods. Secondly, these dealerships have to make their own money. Like, we are all rational agents looking to increase our own benefits, and that only occurs when we make some profit. And we have to understand that in some states, the commission to these dealerships are so low that they don't even cover the costs of operating these dealerships. So here's where your question features in. What this does is, one, it leads to these ration dealers creating a side shop or a kirana shop right on the same property, even though it is not allowed. What this does is it solves the problem of limited volumes, because now consumers are offered a larger choice. Secondly, another way for them to do this is to not give any beneficiary the full entitlement. So, say you are a family of 4 people, you're entitled to 20 kgs of wheat or rice. The ration shop guy will tell you that, listen, we haven't gotten the entire supply from the state, which is why I can only give you 15 kgs, which is 3 people's entitlement. And as a poor person, you don't have the bargaining power to do anything about it. So you take that 15 kgs, but what happens with that 5 kg that is left? The ration shop dealer now has the power to take this into the open market and sell it and make a profit, because he probably bought it at a very subsidized rate from the state government. He can now sell it at a much higher profit markup in the open market. But this sort of defeats the purpose of what the state wanted to do with, providing ration through the PDS dealerships. So I think this is where the idea of bureaucratic mobilization comes in. When does state policy fail? It fails when state capacity is low. State capacity is the ability of the government to translate what it wants to do into what it actually does. For this, you require very, very effective bureaucracy. Now, I'll take the particular example of Chhattisgarh when I talk about this, because this is one state where bureaucratic mobilization was seen a lot. So, what Chhattisgarh did immediately was create over 600 additional posts when it came to food inspectors, people who monitor food quality, people who monitor the movement of these grains to ensure low leakages. Secondly, there were very, very low transfers. In over 10 years, there were less than 10 transfers of the food secretary in Chhattisgarh, which is remarkable, but also something that should be normalized across all states. And more than that, they also increased the commission from 8 rupees a quintal to 35 rupees a quintal. That is a very, very large increase in the commission that the state is paying to these dealers, which reduces their incentives to, have leakages and, embezzle. And the bureaucracy was mobilized by the politicians. They were told that there is no way that the PDS can fail in Chhattisgarh. So there was a personal stake attached to it. You knew that if you were responsible for the PDS not succeeding in Chhattisgarh, you would be transferred out. So I think that is one very, very key element when it comes to the implementation of a policy, which is bureaucratic mobilization.
Right. So you mentioned about state capacity as one of the prime reasons due to which on-ground difference happens in the ration distribution. This reminds me of a very interesting paper I read by Devesh, Kapur and Aditya Dasgupta on bureaucratic overload. Do you think that this concept is relevant to what you're speaking?
I do think so. So I think Kapur and Dasgupta's paper was one of the first papers I read in my course about state capacity as well. And I think it plays a very important role in terms of the literature it's contributing to, but also the idea that there is. This idea is linked to two things: bureaucratic mobilization, but also political will, which I'll get into in a few minutes. But to understand what did that, Dasgupta and Kapur mean by bureaucratic overload? Bureaucratic overload is a situation where the bureaucracy is under-resourced and overutilized, where they have too many policies to implement but not enough resources to do so. And I think that's where the idea of creating over 600 new posts in Chhattisgarh comes in. One part of under-resourcing is also not having enough human capital or not being able to have enough well-trained people to carry out these jobs. And that's exactly what Chhattisgarh did. They didn't burden the existing bureaucracy. They created 600 new posts. They trained these people to carry out these tasks, and they were able to overcome this bureaucratic overload through the creation of new posts. But now, why doesn't this happen in every state? Dasgupta and Kapur say that this is because when policies are implemented by the bureaucracy, the state or the politicians cannot take any credit for it because, the line of accountability gets blurred. Now, if I know that this policy is getting implemented well because, the bureaucracy is functioning well, I can't vote for the bureaucracy, right? I need a face to vote for. And I think that's also, again, interesting when it comes to Chhattisgarh, where Raman Singh, who was a chief minister from 2003 to quite recently, he became the face of the public distribution system. It was not a member of the bureaucracy. It was not the food secretary. It was Raman Singh who became the face of the public distribution system. And that brings me to the idea of political will. Political will is the leader in power making sustained efforts to reform a policy over time. This becomes important because if, as a leader, I'm doing this just around an election cycle, it's a democracy. If you made a certain promise, people will hold you accountable to it in the next election cycle. Secondly, in India, we see patronage working very heavily, wherein before elections, you will see people giving cycles, TV sets, computers, laptops, you name it, and it's been sold in some state as a way of buying votes. But what is interesting about using the PDS itself is the fact that people don't want to reform policies. Rather, politicians don't want to reform policies because they tend to be long term in nature. They don't fit into this 5-year cycle of an election, but the PDS does. And this is how. The PDS is giving you food grains. Food grains is a tangible good. It's a tangible benefit that is being periodically supplied to a household on a regular basis. If a politician is able to reform the PDS and effectively transfer this food into your house every single month, he has won your vote. And that's exactly what happened in Chhattisgarh. Within the first term of coming into power, Raman Singh made multiple reforms to the PDS. He reduced leakages by almost 70% in the state, and he was able to get elected 2 more times as the chief minister of Chhattisgarh. And I think that is what is interesting, that political will can become so important, where it's the will of the leader to want to do something for the people. It's the leader making these promises over time. And it's the leader actually implementing real policy change, understanding the ground reality. So when Raman Singh created the 600 new posts, he was effectively mobilizing the bureaucracy. When Raman Singh increased the commission, he knew this is going to come out of the coffers of the state government, but he still did it because he knew that if reforming the PDS was important to him, both electorally and maybe even as a person, he required to do so. And what that effectively did is when people thought of Raman Singh, they thought of the food in their house that was being given to them every single month. And when there is food security for the poor, you've ensured the biggest goal that the PDS had. And I think on that note, we should take a short break.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Mind the Gender Gap, host Naina Kumar talks to experts Niharika Vora and Deepta Ravula about the social, structural, and economic barriers women entrepreneurs face. On Big Talk About Tiny Humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna explain how to talk to children about porn. Can you be forced to vote? Host Priya Mirza talks about this on The Longest Constitution. On Press Decode, Sarah Vagda and Prafulla discuss the recent controversy surrounding Indian languages. And on Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav shares exactly what India's culinary heritage can teach us. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, we've been doing a series of profiles of people within the office, so do check that out for sure. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We have a page on our website, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, with a list of all our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you, the listener, responds to the advertising on our network. And also, we just want to know a little bit more about you. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It will really help us build some better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, SBI Life Insurance and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Welcome back from the break. We were just talking about the role of bureaucratic mobilization and political will in the implementation of the PDS. But I think we might still be missing a piece of the puzzle. But before that, Swarnashree, do you have any other questions for me?
Yeah, I do. Well, you actually mentioned how effective implementation of PDS is largely a function of the political will because of the very visible and tangible benefits that it does to the people. Do you think that there are other factors that affect this implementation of the PDS?
Now that you mention it, I do agree with you that there is one probably missing piece to this puzzle, and that is the role of civil society. Now, civil society refers to people, to organizations that ensure and hold the politicians accountable and ensure that the policy is implemented well. Now, when it comes to the PDS, this includes cooperatives being responsible for, say, running the ration shops themselves, self-help groups running it, maybe even the Gram Panchayat running it, which is something we saw in Chhattisgarh again, where there was complete deprivatization of the ration shops, and all of them are now run by cooperatives or self-help groups. A second thing to consider is the presence of right to food campaigns. These are able to provide judicial measures and raise petitions on behalf of citizens to the court and ensure that wherever there is discrepancy between what the policy promises versus what the policy is really doing. And apart from this, obviously, it is, as you mentioned in one of our previous conversations, the role of actually people knowing their own entitlements. Do people know how much they're entitled to? And I think this is where some states are making large strides. They are using a network of Anganwadi workers, healthcare workers, teachers, and anyone who people will be willing to listen to tell them that this is what you're entitled to. These are the various grievance redressal mechanisms that are available to you. And they're basically trying to increase the bargaining power of the poor themselves, because we have to understand that the poor are economically dependent on the PDS to a certain extent. And if we want to increase their bargaining power when it comes to holding, say, the dealership accountable for what they've done, or for not providing them with a full ration, they need to be aware of everything possible when it comes to who could they go to, how could they get this problem resolved, and whether they actually have the right to the food that they're being denied or not. And I think that completes the three-legged stool that I like to talk about, which is called political commitment, which is made up of bureaucratic mobilization, political will, and the engagement of civil society. Now, why does PDS or maybe any other policy fail in a lot of situations in India is because of the fact that the three legs are not present at the same time. I'd like to believe that states where you have all three legs present at a given time, the policy will be successful. This is because the different parts of political commitment, which is political will, bureaucratic mobilization, as well as civil society engagement, will hold each other accountable and ensure that reforms are carried out and that the policy actually achieves what it needs to do. This is what happened in Chhattisgarh under Raman Singh. You had all three factors present throughout the course of his leadership, and you had leakages fall by over 70% during his tenure. At the same time, in a lot of other states in the same time period, that is between 2004-5 and 2011-12, the fall has been meager. And you look further into the state's own politics and you will realize it's because one or more of these legs is missing, or if it's present, it's a little wobbly because there is no surety and stability over time. So I think these three factors are what really affects implementation of a policy on ground and is responsible for either the success or partial failure of a policy when it comes to providing welfare to its people.
Well, it's funny you actually kept the question that I wanted to ask next. I wanted to know that how do you account for the lack of awareness that people have about this PDS policy? Like, public policy makers, shouldn't they take into account that people on ground do not know how much of their rights are being denied or how much are they being assigned? Before making a policy, the policymaker should take into account that the policy is targeted towards an audience that necessarily does not know that what are they supposed to receive and what not. Making an awareness among the people should not be a secondary challenge. It should be a primary consideration while making a policy. What do you think about this?
I do agree with you on the fact that policymakers have to account for the lack of, people knowing about their rights and what they're entitled to, which is also why I think in large part India's the movement that has occurred to, bank everyone, get people into the banking system has failed, because while you've been able to get people to open bank accounts, there has been absolutely no financial literacy. Financial literacy, again, was an afterthought after the opening of bank accounts, when they realized that people were not using the bank accounts because, well, people didn't know how to. And I think, but the problem, or rather the question when it comes to the PDS, is that since it's existed for such a long time, there is a ubiquitous belief that every individual is going to get 5 kgs of rice, wheat, or something. People know that. What people don't know is that if you're a household of more than 7 members and you're a priority household, you will still get ration only for those 7 members. The eighth member will not get ration, because the priority household rules are that you get 5 kgs per person, but 35 kgs or 35 kgs a household, which is to say, if you have 8 members, you will not be entitled to eighth member's entitlement. But again, that's a very tiny concern, because there are very few ration cards that have more than 8 members on them or 7 members on them. But I think the larger concern is, again, not whether people are aware of their entitlements or not, because right now the entitlements under the PDS have become ubiquitous. They haven't been changed over the last 20 years. I think it's ad hoc allocation. So when it comes to, say, COVID, and the government announced the Pradhan Mantri Garib Ann Kalyan Yojana, households would not be aware of the fact that they were entitled to 5 additional kgs. So when the government implemented an ad hoc policy that has now almost become permanent, given the fact that it was started back in April 2020, but it extended right up to April 2022, were enough efforts made to educate people that they were entitled to this 5 additional kgs per person? I don't think so. I personally did not see page long ads about this, did not hear about it on All India Radio. I don't think enough education was done about this. So, at times of crisis where people have lost their incomes, there was still not enough awareness made about it. However, in the long term, in non crisis situations, the things that people need to be educated about is grievance redressal. You need to increase their bargaining power. It's something I mentioned earlier, that these are from economically weaker sections of society. Their bargaining power against the dealer is very low. Their bargaining power against the state is very low. And if they're not made aware of all mechanisms available to them to get their entitlement, they will probably never be able to receive full entitlement. And that's where, say, having a toll free number where you can come and call, having dealerships that are not from upper caste, but rather from the community themselves, play a very crucial role. Apart from obviously the state educating its own people. And I think that is what is important, that when you have ad hoc allocations made to the PDS, you need to educate people about it. You need to educate people about the grievance redressal mechanisms available to them. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Well, it's funny you mentioned about the lack of bargaining power that exists among the people, because this reminds me of the articles that I've read that report how people have been often forced to buy their ration at a rather retail price rather than the subsidized price at which they are promised at by the government.
Right. Now, I think this goes back to one of my initial points, which was, about the endemic issue to the PDS, which is low volumes. Now, why the dealer is charging you a higher price, or the retail price, so to speak, is because whatever is the difference between the issue price, so say that's 3 rupees for rice or wheat, and whatever he's charging you, say 20, 30 rupees, the difference is what he can pocket, because he on books cannot show that he sold it for the market price. So this is again a part of the corruption. And I think this is interesting because there are multiple articles talking about this idea that a way to resolve the endemic issue of choice is to, of limited volumes, is to introduce a choice-based system where households should be allowed to, purchase what they need rather than what the state decides. And I think this faces two challenges. One, where did the PDS originate? The PDS originated as a very paternalistic policy where the state decided that you need to be given food grains to ensure food security. However, I think a better way to frame the policy maybe is to say that they wanted to ensure that no one goes hungry. It's the idea that you're eating enough calories, and these calories are coming from staples. Rice and wheat are very calorie dense, but not nutrient dense. So, therefore, the state is able to achieve its objective of giving you enough calories so you have the energy to carry out work. But nutrient wise, maybe not as much. And that is why the state has restricted itself to staples. Second problem is with a lot of things that carry nutrients, which is vegetables, fruits, milk, they're perishable items. Getting them into the state first of all, the procurement has to be done centrally, then has to be transported to the states, which then has to be further transported to every single PDS shop. It is a very large transportation cost. It's a very large storage cost. And above all of that, these are perishable goods. The health consequences of supplying spoiled perishable goods is much larger than probably allowing the PDS to act as an implicit income transfer, which sort of creates a buffer in the income that an individual has and allows them to spend on other things. And I think that's how we really need to look at the PDS. The PDS is not saying that we are going to meet all your food needs. That is not what the PDS aims to do. The PDS is saying that, say, if you were buying in the open market 10 kgs of rice at 20 rupees a kg, you were going to spend 200 rupees on it. But now, why the PDS you're spending only 20 rupees on it? What does this mean? You have over 180 rupees left for you, which you would have spent on rice, available for you to now spend on other food items. And that is what the PDS really aims to do, where it aims to not introduce choice in the form of more availability at the ration shop, because the state is already running into losses with the ration it is already providing you with deficits, but providing a larger set of choices available to the consumer by reducing the constraint on their income itself, by providing them with this 10 to 15% implicit income transfer in the form of the PDS, which is an in-kind transfer provided to the people. I think that is a better way to look at what the PDS does and what it aims to do.
Well, but don't you think that the paternalism of the state then deprives people of their right to choose that, okay, what goods do I want and what do not?
I don't necessarily agree with that, and that's based on this idea that poor people tend to be myopic. They don't engage in savings. Secondly, multiple papers ranging from Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee's The Lives of the Poor have shown that when cash transfers are given to the poor, they don't tend to spend it on things that would provide them with nutrients and calories, but rather on other things. And we have to remember, India is a largely patriarchal society. Over here, when a cash transfer is made, and it is generally made in the name of whoever has a bank account, it's generally a male. And what this does is that it has also been noted that through a study done by Duncan Thomas in Brazil, that men are more likely to spend on their own utility rather than spend on the utility of the family, which means that it is women that need to be targeted with these policies. Yet women are unbanked. We don't have enough brick and mortar post offices and banks in India to carry out such a large scale cash transfer. The feasibility is very low. So I think that's where the discrepancy will come in about the ethics of whether the people should be allowed to make their choices and the feasibility of a policy. When we say that people should be allowed to make their choices, one, are they able to make these choices while rationalizing the fact that they need to have XY amount of calories to be able to carry out the job that they're doing? Are they aware of that? Secondly, are we 100% sure that if we give them an equivalent amount as a cash transfer, they would be spending it on the same goods and services rather than spending it on something completely tangential, like, say, entertainment, transportation, or festivals, or tobacco and alcohol, which is something that has been noticed in a lot of poor households, that a lot of your cash transfer ends up going to these services rather than going towards food. And I think last but not the least, if we're suggesting that the PDS needs to be replaced with something that provides greater choice to consumers, we're suggesting a direct bank transfer or a cash transfer to happen to people. Yet, India is not in a position feasibility wise to do this because, one, very, very large exclusion errors come out of this. And I think that raises a bigger ethical question that are you in a position where you can socially exclude people who are not banked, people who don't have Aadhaar, people who don't have documentation? Can you just explicitly get them out of the way and not give them a cash transfer even though they're poor? Secondly, how do you account for the fact that a very, very large part of rural India does not have banks or does not have the bandwidth to carry out such a large number of transactions where you will have the entire village going to the bank to try and transact? Thirdly, the PDS does not have transaction costs involved beyond just the dealership. When you have a direct cash transfer, a person has to travel to the bank. A person has to probably forego a day's a daily wage to stand at the bank and get the money that they require. And even then, there are going to be multiple challenges associated with this. So I think the question then becomes that, is the ethics of providing this people with a choice a bigger dilemma, or is it going to be ensuring that people have the minimum amount of food that they need to survive? Because that's where the paternalism stems from, that the state wants to ensure that you have energy to carry out economic activity. That is the only thing that will cause upward economic mobility in people.
Well, so now that we spoke about the factors that affect the on-ground implementation of PDS, and then also the ethical ways, ethical considerations that come up that the government is also dealing with. What do you think lies ahead for PDS?
I think in a nation with such a large proportion of people living below the poverty line, the PDS will continue as a way for the government to ensure food security, at least in terms of ensuring that no one goes to bed hungry. I think that is the role that PDS will continue to play even in the coming years. But I think over and above that, I do see a shift in the provision of the goods itself. I do believe that as and when our supply chains get stronger, our dealerships are able to make profits, we might be able to see a more diversified range of goods being offered through the PDS. However, that obviously depends on the financial health of the government itself, on the deficit and surpluses it's running on. But I think above that, all states have recognized that political will, bureaucratic mobilization, and civil society are important. While they may not have been able to achieve them yet, I do notice quite a few states that are working towards trying to achieve all of these three factors. And I think what the first big tangible shift that we will see is maybe better implementation of the PDS if we're being optimistic. But over and above that, I believe that the PDS will get more efficient over time, especially with a large policy like the NFSA coming in. And as we still wait for data to come in from the third round of the IHDS, which should be able to tell us the effect of, the NFSA on food security and on people's, spending behaviors. I do feel like we are moving towards gradual but positive change when it comes to ensuring food security for India's citizens. And in any kind of welfare policy, to sort of make it a little broader than just the PDS, I feel like in terms of any welfare policy that needs to be implemented in India, political commitment, the three factors we spoke of that are a part of political commitment, will play a very large role. And a couple of friends and I, we ran some basic regressions with IHDS data and found that between Bihar and Chhattisgarh, where Chhattisgarh has political commitment but Bihar doesn't, the difference in offtake per individual household was 10 kgs, which is the entitlement of two people. Now, if that doesn't tell you what big a role political commitment can play when it comes to implementation of a public policy, I don't know what will. But those are my concluding thoughts. Swarnashree, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you from this conversation. I think I'm completely convinced that political commitment plays a very important role in the effective implementation of policies in general. I mean, we're talking about PDS over here, but I think policies in general would have a major change on how they affect people based on the political commitment of the leaders. But I would like to add further just this one point that I think policymakers should take more accountability of making sure that the target people for whom they make the policies are more aware of the policies and their rights. And, so the issues that we were talking about, how they lack the bargaining power, the fact that people end up buying resources at the retail price because they do not know that they are getting products at a subsidized price, or even for the fact that they don't even know what is the limit of goods that they are supposed to get from the government. I think this stems largely from the fact that they're not well educated, well aware of the policies. And there is a major need, I think, for policymakers to take into account as a primary consideration while making the policies, that policymakers should actually sit and think that, okay, how can I make people know about these policies, and then make sure that, okay, this is how I want the policies to be implemented.
That was a very insightful thought. But thank you so much for joining me today. This was a great conversation where I completely gave up on the role as a host and put you on the spot for the questions. But thank you so much for joining me and for having this conversation.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
If you're a cricket fan, check out Edges and Sledges, India's favorite cricket podcast.
The podcast focuses on Indian cricket, the IPL, and has a ton of banter both on and off the field.
We talk about the week's biggest cricket stories with current and ex-international cricketers, coaches, or sometimes just between us.
And it's hosted by me, DJ.
Me, Varun.
And me, Ashwin.
New episodes release every week.
You can catch us on the IVM Podcast's website, app,
or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.